Hi everyone, this is Paul here from the Magdalene Centre. Today I'm going to be talking about the astrology for September, outlining the general themes of the month along with some of the key dates of it. Now, in terms of the key dates and the events that take place, each one represents a key turning point of sorts. The first one is the 6th of September, which is the full moon in Pisces. This will be conjunct Neptune, so it's going to be a particularly powerful full moon. The next date is the 10th of September, when Pallas Athena turns retrograde in Taurus, and she'll remain retrograde until she turns direct in Aries on the 17th of December. Then on the 20th we have strong new moon in Virgo, and at this point there will be 5 different bodies in Virgo itself, so it'll be a very packed sign. 2 days later, on the 22nd of September, the Sun marks the autumn equinox, it transits into Libra, and lastly on the 28th of September we come to the end of the Pluto retrograde, which started way back in April. So those are the key dates. Alongside this, the themes that the Sun highlights, beginning with Sun's transit through Virgo which started in August and continues up until the 22nd of September. During this theme, or this period, we're looking at themes associated with Virgo. So these are things like health, work, service, and issues like self-improvement and understanding where do we undermine ourselves with things like perfectionism, or where do we allow self-criticism to undermine our ability to perform things, and to develop a greater sense of self-acceptance, where when we recognise areas where we aren't doing as well as we want to be doing, rather than judging ourselves and then victimising ourselves as a result, we look at it objectively, and instead of seeing it as a failure, look at it as a learning experience. This is one of the key changes in perspective that helps us to achieve the best of Virgo. It's rather than having an attitude of perfectionism and that if we don't achieve a certain level of something we must be a failure, it's learning to see everything as an opportunity to learn something new, or to improve on something where it's not going as well as initially intended. Because if we can have an attitude of learning and a desire to honestly improve ourselves without judging ourselves harshly if we don't quite get to where we think we should be, then we can use the energies of Virgo constructively. Because Virgo takes that raw creative impulse of Leo and it refines it into something more useful, and can convert an unrealised project into a service for other people. Because service is a key. Service can be, as weird as it may sound, service can actually be an antidote to suffering. Because rather than focusing on ourselves constantly and falling into the trap of introverted narcissism, where we're constantly looking inwards and we ignore what's going on around us, we criticise other people for exhibiting the same flaws that we see within ourselves. We instead look at ways of how can we use our own personal gifts and skills to improve situations for other people. How can we use an outward focus of participation and improving other people's circumstances to break free of limited negative thinking, so we're not focused on where we're not doing things well, we're not focused on criticising ourselves constantly. Our energy is directed outwards in an attitude of service, and there's been plenty of studies which show that the act of giving can actually bring more rewards than the act of receiving something, as long as it's done with the right intentions. Virgo also deals with physical and mental health. So in terms of physical, this obviously includes things like how conscious are we of our diet, and how much exercise are we getting to make sure that our bodies remain strong and capable. And it's also mental health. So this is dealing with things like, if we have a tendency to criticise ourselves, this can seriously undermine our health, because it may stop us from taking the actions that would help boost our health. So you think about when you want to achieve something but you talk yourself out of it because of that sense of not being good enough. So during this time, total self-acceptance is key for us to make the most of things and to turn potential failures into learning opportunities rather than something to put ourselves down with. So this is the first part of the month, and it's a key area that can help us to grow if we decide to, rather than judge ourselves and others, we learn to be humble, we accept where we didn't do things as well as we intended, but we can see how we can improve it going forward. If we just have that attitude, life gets a lot easier, because instead of constantly putting ourselves down over past mistakes and tormenting ourselves, it's just like, well, happened, can't change it, but I can learn from this. This is the new wisdom I've obtained through making those errors in the first place. Now I know, well, now we know where things don't work for that reason, but we can change it like this so it will work. That's all we really need to do. Now, the full moon in Pisces that I mentioned on the 6th, this is particularly powerful because the moon itself will be conjunct Neptune at the time of the full moon, and Neptune being retrograde in its home sign of Pisces is particularly powerful. We may all feel as though our psychic sense is a lot higher than they are later on in the year, and some of us may find this particularly overwhelming. But the thing with the full moon in Pisces, this is a time to remember that spirit and matter are not separate. They're two different manifestations of the same thing. Now obviously I'll be doing a separate video on it, so I'll go into far more detail there. But basically this particular full moon is about bringing spiritual health, mental health and physical health together. So seeing ourselves not as separate beings, but we see mind, body and spirit as all a cohesive whole. And by doing this we achieve holistic health, so our mind, body and spirit is healthy, which further allows us to embrace the attitude of service, because when we are strong within ourselves and we don't feel any kind of insecurities as such, then it's a lot easier to have an attitude of service, because we realise that it's not about being beneath other people, it's about the act of giving. It's the act of translating love into actions that help others, as long as the actions that we do not lead to any kind of dependency on the other person. That's a whole other topic. The next date I mentioned was Pallas Athena. She's turning retrograde on the 10th of this month. Pallas is in Taurus at the moment, and for anyone who's not particularly familiar with her, she is the goddess of wisdom, of healing, of creativity and of politics. In Taurus, the kind of wisdom we're talking about is common sense, practicality, but she's also dealing with things like ecology and land reform and physical healing that we get through hands-on healing, as opposed to taking herbal medicine or anything like this. So during this transit, Pallas will be asking us to reevaluate how we invest our creative energy in these sorts of areas, and to look at the politics of ecology. This thing is, the more we can understand natural cycles, the more we can sync up with them and take advantage of them to get the most out of things. It doesn't mean that we need to exploit things, but if we understand the natural cycles of life and we sync up with them, then life gets a lot easier, because it stops being about fight to control things, and it's more about going with the natural flow of things. So So during this time, the more we can understand natural cycles and apply them to our daily lives, and try and work with natural cycles rather than against them, the easier life can get, and more likely healthier we'll be. But we're doing another video on this, so this is just the overview. There's no point going into too much detail at this point. The other date that I mentioned was the new moon in Virgo. This particular new moon is an opportunity to set new beginnings, and the fruits of which we'll then be harvesting around about February time next year. But the new moon in Virgo is an opportunity to set new intentions to radiate the higher levels of Virgo, which is things like humility, service, being conscious of our health and making reasonably conscious choices about things like our diets, our sleeping patterns, the amount of exercise we do. It's also an opportunity to set intentions to become more organised. This doesn't mean that slavish or nitpicky, but the more organised we are with our practical things, the more time we then free up for ourselves to do the things we enjoy. And it's also time to try and transform that inner critic within us. We all have this inner critic, this something that we've had developed within us over time, where people and the institutions around us basically tell us you can't do this, or if you're not doing this, then you're not good enough, or if you don't look or act a certain way, then there's something wrong with you. And these voices then, over time through conditioning, get embedded within our own minds, and then they sabotage our own development through perfectionistic attitudes. So it's important that we do address this and learn to release the inner critic. It doesn't mean that we judge it, it doesn't mean we hate it or express any negative emotions towards it. That's counterproductive. We have to learn to love ourselves properly, and not just have the self-love being an empty mantra or an empty philosophy or some triaphism that we follow. It's something that we actually do. So we love ourselves enough that we don't allow that inner critic to stop us from taking actions that we know will lead to greater freedom. And we also use unconditional self-acceptance as a tool against this, because if we can accept ourselves on both our good days and our bad, then the inner critic loses a lot of power over us, because we realise that we don't have to achieve this this idea of perfection that the ego tells us to do, because the only form of perfection we can really achieve is at the soul level. The ego at the end of the day is an illusion, a necessary one for us to engage, to be able to interact with the world around us, but at the end of the day it is not the one in charge, or should not be. The soul should always be in charge, but for whatever reason this ego gets elevated, and then it undermines our ability to take the actions necessary to pursue our dreams. Then 2 days later we have the autumn equinox, with the sun moving into Libra. This is a time where day and night are equal, and symbolically this is where we bring both the light parts of ourselves and the shadow side into balance. We bring the two sides together and hold them in a state of paradox, so it's possible for us to transform them. Because things we can only achieve a greater degree of light within us if we face more and more of the darkness within and transform it. And if we have the courage to face those shadow sides within us and accept them without feeling need to judge them, then we're taking a key step in transforming ourselves. Now the thing with this is not just the negative side, so it's also the interactions that we have with other people. Some people just trigger us, they press our buttons because they're showing us the shadow parts of ourselves that we haven't dealt with. Other people, on the other hand, we cross paths with them and they inspire us. What they're doing is they're showing us the higher manifestations of the same energy, and they show us what we have the potential to achieve as well, if we take the actions and we take responsibility for ourselves to reach this higher level. And Libra, most of its emphasis seems to get placed on relationships conventionally, but the most important relationship is with ourselves, and the most important place to create that balance is inside us. Because if we can achieve internal balance, that then makes it a lot easier for balance to manifest outside ourselves, because whatever is manifested within can then manifest without. If we try to achieve balance externally through controlling things, we'll always be feeling tense, feeling anxious about what's going to go wrong next. If we create the balance inside ourselves though, then what's going on around us ceases to have that power to control our emotional side. And when we can achieve this kind of balance within us without judgment, then we can achieve the true sense of peace that Libra is allegedly renowned for. But it requires us to do the internal work of creating inner balance rather than trying to force it externally. And then the last one I mentioned in terms of key dates is Pluto turning direct on the 28th. Pluto's been retrograde since April and showing us the shadow sides of ourselves, the parts of us where we deny our power or we're afraid of it because we know that embracing that power requires a lot of responsibility, and many of us, for whatever reason, have grown up to not want any kind of responsibility, even though responsibility is the price of freedom. And with Pluto showing, Pluto is unrelenting truth. Doesn't matter how much you try and avoid it, Pluto will show the dark sides of us that we don't like, usually through other people, not because they are bad, but because they're a convenient projection for our own shadow self. But the key transformation requires us to stop seeing it as purely external and seeing it as someone's fault, and ask ourselves, where have we been shown that same behaviour, and how can we transform it? As Pluto turns direct, whatever power we've reclaimed within ourselves through this process of acknowledging it, facing it, and forgiving ourselves through self-love and acceptance of things that we may not be proud of. But if we can do this, we can step into our power properly. We can unlock far more of that intense fire that drives us to achieve things. But rather than using it for personal gain, we channel it into transpersonal pursuits. Now the last thing, and possibly the most important, is the overall theme for this month. Is generated by, there's a minor grand trine which is 2 sextiles and a trine, so this is between the Pallas Athena in Taurus, Pluto in Capricorn, and Neptune in Pisces. This energy is all about healing, both through transformation, through facing our deepest fears, but also through opening the crown chakra and allowing the spiritual energy to flow through us and dissolve the old negative structures within us that no longer serve us. This energy also achieves a focal point through Virgo, so Virgo is very much highlighted in September, with at least 5 different bodies passing through it. The first will be the Sun reaching that opposition point with Neptune and completing the trine. So each of the bodies passing through Virgo are being asked to transform if possible. So with the Sun, it's transforming that sense of self-identity through acknowledging the spiritual side of our being rather than trying to keep it compartmentalized and see it something as external to ourselves, because ultimately we are spiritual beings having a human experience, but many of us have been still believe it's the opposite way around. That's the Sun changing our identity, having that sense of identity changed. We also have Mercury passing through, so our thought patterns, our style of communication, we may well feel it's necessary to transform our words, transform our thoughts, and communicate things through love, through spiritual understanding, and through desire for authentic transformation as we acknowledge the truth of who we are, and we delve deeper and deeper past the layers of illusion that we've built up around us to achieve a more accurate perception of who we are. Mars and Venus also pass through. Venus, as well as being about relationships and love, is also our value system and how we assess information. So Venus passing through this point is about understanding that love is not just at the everyday level, it's also spiritual, and vice versa. It's not just spiritual love and valuing spiritual stuff, we have to radiate that love to the external environment around us as well. And Mars is being asked to transform our desires and our actions through this process of embodying truth, of embracing the spiritual side of ourselves, so that our actions are driven from the heart. Because if our actions are driven by the honest desire for service, because we see service as an outlet for that spiritual love within us, then there is so much transformation we can achieve to having our sense of identity, our thoughts, our value system, and our actions being transformed through spiritual love, through the power of truth, and through healing, by getting in touch with the cycles of nature and understanding where we fit into it, rather than trying to fight against the world around us. The more we can understand our place within it, the more we can embrace the truth of who we are and what our real legacy should be. So what is our personal mountain to climb, and how do we open the crown chakra to allow spiritual love to flow through us and radiate outwards. By embracing this and transforming ourselves, we can undergo a radical transformation during September, where we reach that point where we are in the world but not of it. We realise that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and that we can be very loving first towards ourselves and then towards others. I hope it's a useful guide for September. It's a very powerful month, although the energy may be slow moving, but it's one that brings us much transformation if we choose to consciously embrace it. But remember, the astrologer does not control our lives. It's like the weather. If we know what the weather's going to be doing, we can prepare for it. If we don't, we may get caught up in something we didn't particularly want, but the weather doesn't control our internal responses. We choose that. If we know how to respond, or we know what's going to happen, we can prepare ourselves and make the best of it. So I hope it's a useful guide for you. May September bring many blessings and a very positive, powerful transformation. Take care.